And I'm very pleased to have so many here tonight. I'd like to introduce to you our guest speaker, Alan Baumler, a historian from the Montana Historical Society, talking to you about, as you know, Chinese in Montana. If anybody didn't get one of these, I can hand them to you now. Okay.
Thank you all for coming tonight. It's always nice for me to be in Missoula. And we're going to talk about the Chinese in Montana. I don't know how much you all know about that. It's probably the largest unwritten chapter of Montana's history. And you know, we really haven't known a lot about this topic. What we do know is that there was a population explosion in Guangdong province, which is around Canton, and that prompted a lot of people to come to the United States, actually to California, in during the 1848-1849 gold rush. And we have to kind of go back and look at that because that is the population that eventually migrated to Colorado, to Idaho, and then to Montana, along with others. But there is a core there of experienced miners. And the thing that I think that's really interesting and kind of strange is that when gold was discovered in California in 1848, it took 7 months. Well, it took quite a long time, first of all, for word to get back east that gold had been discovered, first of all. And then it took 7 months of travel for anyone from the eastern seaboard to get to California. It took 3 months to travel from China to California. And so you can see why, by the time Americans got to California to check out the gold rush, why there was a whole set of Chinese miners already there, camps already in place. And so that population was strictly male, not very many women. And so when the population moved to Colorado and then to Idaho and then to Montana with the various gold strikes, it was a single male population for the most part, not entirely, but for the most part. So by 1870, Chinese comprised 10% of Montana's territorial population, which is a very significant number of folks. By the 1950s, there were very few who remained here. Their homes and businesses fell victim to urban renewal programs. Time erased their very remote mining camps and railroad camps. If I could have the next slide, Cheryl. Traces of their culture disappeared, and their stories became the stuff of myth and legend, which is what we have been left with, really. Like these structures here that are sometimes known as Chinese ovens. I don't know if you've ever heard of Chinese ovens or seen them along the Northern Pacific Railroad grades or other railroad grades here in Montana. What these are Italian bread ovens made by Italian railroad workers and not by Chinese. Obviously, the Chinese didn't make bread. And so, you know, this is just an example of the myths and the legends that we deal with as historians, and some of those we'll talk about tonight. Some of them are, I can tell you, very hard to let go of, but we're going to talk about that tonight anyway. And so we'll look at the history of this ethnic group by looking at what they left behind. Next slide. By 1870, there were nearly 2,000 Chinese in Montana, They did make up 10% of the territorial population, but you can see that of the 149 Chinese, there were 123 women. And you know, that's quite a bizarre ratio, really. And it didn't get any better as time went on. You can see there. Next slide. In Helena, the largest ethnic group was Chinese. And in 1870, there were 633, which in Helena, the population in 1870 was about 3,000. So that's 20% of the population in Helena. Very large percentage of Chinese there. Could I have the next one? There were very harsh laws, and the 1872 law, there was a special tax on Chinese laundries, and there was a law, a territorial law, that said that aliens, foreign non-citizens couldn't own mining claims, and they were trying actually to limit the amount of property that foreign-born people had. And of course that it extended to the Chinese too. But in 1882, then there was the Chinese Exclusion Act. That was a federal law that prohibited Chinese laborers from entering the United States. And in 1909, Montana passed its own miscegenation law, which said that anyone who was white could not marry African American, Indian, Chinese, or Japanese. And there were mixed couples that lived in many communities, but they actually lived outside the law, and the law said that they could not. Then you can see that quote at the end, the Chinaman is no more a citizen than a coyote. And he can never be. His habits are disgusting. He's a parasite floating across the Pacific. And basically that is that's the tenor of the times. That's what the Chinese had to endure here in the United States, and particularly in Montana. Could I have the next one? Part of the problem was that many Chinese in urban areas opened laundries. And the reason that they opened laundries is because it was a business that you could open without having a lot of equipment. And so Chinese folks as miners, carried very little with them, and so it was something that they could do and make money. But unfortunately, particularly in Montana and especially in Anaconda, it directly competed with women, because it was probably the only thing that women could do also, aside from keeping a boarding house or sometimes keeping a restaurant. It's the only way that women could make money. And so they were in direct competition. In Anaconda, the Chinese were completely discouraged from opening any kinds of businesses because it did compete with the women, and there were so many widows because of the mines that it was a very serious thing. So if you look at the population of Chinese in Anaconda, it started out with a flourishing population, but by 1900 there weren't any because they had all gone to Butte. There was too much competition. So I had the boycott here in 1896 was an attempt to make citizens leave. And in Butte, you can see what those flyers say, that, you know, that people aren't supposed to patronize Chinese businesses, laundries and restaurants, etc. And there were 3 men that took exception to that, and they were Hum Fei, Quan Loy, and Dr. Hugh Epoch, and they decided to fight this boycott. And so they protested to both the United States government and the Chinese government and filed suit against the leaders of this boycott. A copy of the affidavit signed by Hum Fei and filed against the boycott in Butte is now in the National Archives. They won the case, but they couldn't collect the damages that they were awarded. If I could have the next one. And the other thing, Chinese were often blamed on epidemics that started, and particularly leprosy. This isn't too common in Montana, although there was a case in Missoula in 1882 where a restaurant worker by the name of Kim Lee was diagnosed with leprosy. He had lost a finger, he had all of the signs, and people began to freak out. And so the press actually tried to assuage the population and say, oh, it's really not contagious, don't worry about it, we'll take care of it. And they very quietly deported him. But as you can see from this rather horrible cartoon, Chinese were often blamed for leprosy and for other types of epidemics. I could have the next one. Henry Villard, when the Northern Pacific came across Montana, Henry Villard, who was the president of the railroad, hired 15,000 Chinese workers to lay the tracks. And he also hired a number of Chinese, or I mean a number of Italian workers also. But it was the Chinese that did the most dangerous part of the work. They did the blasting that cut through the Mullen Tunnel, for example, that allowed the train to come through the Continental Divide. And if I could have the next one, and the interesting thing is in our capital, the Montana State Capitol, you may be familiar with this painting, Driving the Golden Spike. And the thing that's really interesting and telling about this painting is that when it was done in 1903, Governor Toole wanted control of all of the artwork in the Capitol. But this particular painting, the Northern Pacific said, we're paying for this painting. We want control of the subject matter. And so he had nothing to say about it. And this is completely Northern Pacific point of view. And you can see Ulysses S. Grant is there, Henry Villard is there, the Indians across whose land the railroad crossed are there. There are laborers in the background, but there are no Chinese. And this is a very telling, I think, a very telling painting. Okay, if I could have the next one. This is Helena in 1870, and in about 1870, and you can see there's very prominently portrayed in the lower center of the drawing. There's a Chinese guy showing that Helena was a place of of great ethnicity, really, and there are Indians there in the streets along with the Chinese, and this is really the only way that we know what it might have been like by the artwork that has been left to us, until we begin to look at some of the other things that maybe we haven't really paid much attention to.
Does that telegraph line date it any closer than approximate? Yes, the telegraph line.
The telegraph came in 1866 in Virginia City, and very soon after that it came to other places. So 1870 would be about the right time period. If I could have the next one. This is a Sanborn fire insurance map. This is Helena in 1884, and very, very clearly in these Sanborn maps, I have a couple of Missoula that I'll show you here in a little bit, but very clearly Chinese property and Chinese dwellings and businesses are very clearly labeled on these maps. And so in this one, I should have brought my laser pointer, but you can see the Chinese gardens noted there. And that's one of the things that the Chinese did that was very important to the early communities, not just in Helena, but in other places too, where they came very early on, because they grew the first produce to sell to the miners, and everything had to come by ox team. And if you had a head of lettuce packed in sawdust and bumping over the trail for 5 weeks, you wouldn't want to eat it by the time it got to your camp. And so it was very important, a very important service that the Chinese did by growing wonderful produce. And at least in Helena, they grew produce long into the 1890s and into the 20th century, and it was one of the.
Would there have been racial slurs in any? I see them. I can see them where I bet the audience cannot. But there are racial slurs in many of these establishments.
Yeah, yeah, and you know, we had many fires in Helena in particular, and they always blamed them on the Chinese when they could. You know, if there wasn't a clear place of origin, it was always Chinatown.
There are several, they have both Chinese and Chink.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you know, they don't ever note any other ethnic group, just Chinese. Yes.
I've read that they, old-timers hesitated to eat Chinese produce because of the Chinese method of fertilization.
Yeah, I probably if people knew that, they might have hesitated. Yeah, it's true. But I don't know if you're a hungry miner and you come out of the hills. I'm not sure they would really care. Okay, so if I could have the next one. This is one of the remnants in Helena. This is called the Yeeoww Cabin, and it is the only standing building that was occupied by Chinese in Helena. If I could have the next one, this is what it looks like today. It is in Reader's Alley. Reader's Alley is actually owned by the state of Montana, but this particular property is the only privately owned house in that little neighborhood. If I could have the next one. The other remnant that is still extant in Helena is what's called China Row, which is outside the tended grounds of Forestvale Cemetery. There are 200 Chinese graves. Only a few of them are marked. You can see those tombstones. If I could have another one. You can find where the burner was. These were ceremonial burners. You find one in Phillipsburg. There's one in Butte, but they have long been disassembled. This is not exactly intact, but at least the pile of bricks are there. And it was customary during funerals to cook a meal for the person who has died, and so that was the purpose of that. During the 1940s, many relatives of about 40 of Helena's Chinese folks removed their bones and took them back to China. But there was, in San Francisco in particular, in the ports where Chinese people came in, there were these companies, they were called bone collectors. I don't know if you've heard of bone collectors, but they would offer this insurance that if a person died on foreign soil with no relatives to take care for the grave, that they would make these great sweeps throughout the mining camps in the West and dig up the remains and take them back to China if you had paid for that service. In Helena, there was a bone collector, but he didn't do his job apparently, and only about a dozen people's remains that were paid for were actually taken back to China. So most of the 200 people are still buried there. If I could have the next one. You can find typical Chinese ceramics, and we'll look at that in a little bit more detail a little bit later. And the next one, then there's a couple of tombstones. There's this one, and if I could have the next one. This one actually is, you can see the 1928 date on there. And then the next one is an interesting artifact that we have housed in the Pioneer Cabin in Helena, but it is suspected, not for sure, but suspected that it was used by the Chinese because of its very great ingenuity and its simplicity. And all it is a piece of wood with just chopped off pieces of log nailed on there. And it was a very simple way of placer mining. You would pour a bucket of dirt on there, pour a bucket of water. Since gold is the heaviest element in the soil, it would stick in the crevices. You would take a spoon or a stick or something and flick out the pieces of gold. Very effective way, but very tedious. You know, placer mining was tedious anyway. This may have been more tedious than panning, I don't know. But anyway, a very interesting thing called a pole riffle. If I could have the next one. And of course, for quite a long time, Butte did have the largest Chinese population. The Watchung Tai Company and the Meiwa building are the two buildings that are two of the buildings that are still standing from the original Chinatown. If I could have the next one, here you see the Sanborn map. And in Butte's case, the block is labeled Chinatown. In 1914, Butte had 62 Chinese businesses. That's very late for such a large Chinese population. And, you know, Butte did have some women and some families, and that was the case in some of the urban areas, but mostly still it was a very uneven population of mostly single men.
Some of that still remain in Butte then, or is that all
The
gone?
Watchung Thai Company, that building is still standing, and then I'll show you another one here in a moment, and there's only 2 buildings actually. If I could have the next one. This is the interior of the Meiwa Watchung Thai Company historically, and then if I could have the next one, this is the Chinese Mercantile in Butte. Much of the collection of the inventories ended up in Nevada City. If you've ever visited Nevada City, Bovey bought all of those collections in the early 1940s and took them to Nevada City. They were in terrible condition. They were exposed to all kinds of dripping, the ceilings and all of this. And they have now, the whole thing has now been taken to the Butte Archives, where they have that wonderful new storage facility. And all of that is being stored now. And hopefully at some point it will be returned to the Meiwa, which is really where it came from. If I could have the next one. This is the other one. The Pekin Noodle Parlor is an original building built in 1911. And you can see the quote there. It just drives me absolutely crazy. The job that I do at the Montana Historical Society's National Register sign texts. And I had the opportunity to do a sign text for this building and set this history right. Because if you look at the internet, if you Google Pekin Noodle Parlor, you'll see these people who have eaten there, and they say, oh, it's so exciting to eat in a brothel, you know, and those little curtained booths are, you know, the individual cribs. Nothing could be further from the truth. Those curtained booths are something you find in noodle parlors all across the West. Has nothing to do with prostitution. However, prostitutes and Chinese are 2 outcast communities, and you almost always do find red light districts and Chinese settlements together. And there are some good reasons for that. If I could have the next one, besides the fact that they are outcast populations. I've noted where the Pekin Noodle Parlor is, and directly across the street, I don't know how well you can see this, but the buildings all across the street are all labeled female boarding, which is the euphemism for prostitution. And we can always tell where red light districts are because things are labeled female boarding. And so anyway, of course you can see the proximity, and so the assumption is, well, these buildings must be associated too, but not necessarily. Not only were these 2 populations outcast populations, they were also, it was a very symbiotic relationship because the women depended on the noodle parlors for cheap and hearty food. They depended upon the Chinese herbalists and physicians for things that they couldn't get from Western doctors, cures for venereal diseases, birth control, and opium, which, if taken to the point of overdose under the care of a physician, causes spontaneous abortion. And so the women needed the Chinese practitioners. And that's really why those 2 areas are almost always adjacent. Okay, if I could have the next.
Ellen, were there were there prostitution rooms in the alley as well, behind the Pekin?
No, I don't think so. I do not think there was any of that going on here. Over here, yes, everywhere, yeah. And of course, this is, the famous sign for the Pekin Noodle Parlor. They just celebrated their 100th year in 2011, the 100th year in business in the same location, which is, one of the longest running businesses, family-owned businesses in Montana. I could have the next one. Now this is Missoula, and I've heard people tell me, oh yeah, the Chinese cemetery is over there. over somewhere. But this is really interesting, I think, because here you have a bird's eye map of Missoula, 1884. This is the rattlesnake area, the lower rattlesnake area. And you can actually see tombstones over there at the bottom of the hill. And you see what I mean by tombstones, those wooden tombstones. This was from about 1866 until the city cemetery, your city cemetery of today, was opened in 1884. This was the city cemetery. And certainly there are probably Chinese folks buried there. So is everybody else buried there. If I could have the next one. We know that after the neighborhood was platted. This is an 1889 plat map, and you can see the designation for the cemetery there. We know that after 1884, the cemetery continued to be used. There's been one Chinese burial that has come to light, but only one. I think it's fair to say I actually know people who have pieces of coffins in their foundations over in that area. They were still using the cemetery in the 1890s. I know of 2 white burials that occurred there, and they were indigents. So it's really hard to know how long that area was used as a cemetery, but it wasn't exclusively Chinese, as many people think. I can have the next one. And this is your red light district here in Missoula. This is West Front Street, the end of Front Street there, up against the river. And it's interesting that in Missoula, the red light district and the Chinese settlement weren't exactly adjacent. They were actually intermingled. And you can see there, I don't know how well you can see it, but there are Chinese dwellings right next to female boarding houses. If I could have the next one, it might be a little bit more clear. No, not really. You can't really tell, but it's interesting because they are interspersed. Part of that, I think, is because your Chinese population was very small. In 1880, I actually went through the census and counted, and there were, I think, 84 Chinese residents in 1900. Contrary to what a lot of people think, women were not automatically labeled prostitutes. Chinese women, oftentimes people think that they are just, the census taker just arbitrarily labeled them all, but that's absolutely not true. I found 3 women in Missoula. 2 of them are wives. The third one is listed as ill fame. So only one of them was actually in that business.
What is the name of the street today that they have?
West, this is front.
Stevens.
All I know is Front Street is still Front Street, but I'm not sure that this portion is still even there. Front Street kind of ends, I think.
That's all west of Higgins, right?
Mm-hmm. I think that,
Orange Street?
would it be that little street that runs down then and continues down into the carousel?
Yeah,
It's right along
yeah.
the river there.
Yeah.
And this would be where that big high-rise is, that office building here. I'm thinking.
There are 2 up a little bit further up here. There are 2 buildings that are the Gleam or Glime buildings, 1 and 2, and those were brothels run by Mary Glime or Gleam. But I think they're up here a little bit. This was the lower class area down here.
At one point, the Front Street was raised.
Mm-hmm.
There were all these, can you talk about that?
I can't. Maybe you could.
Well, my rumors were that the Chinese gambling dens were underneath the.
We're going to get to that.
Okay.
Not specifically in Missoula, but and that may be that they were. Yeah, that may be that they were.
Ellen, it shows here, I can see it more clearly, right under the number 56. That big block is labeled female boarding, and there's Chinese intermingled all over there.
It's this one here,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, that big
This
block
one.
of
Yeah.
stuff is,
Mhm.
yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know why it's blurry on the screen, but anyway.
Is that where Mary Glam had her establishment?
No, hers were further up here.
Oh.
Yeah. And this is, this is 1890. I think hers were a little bit later time period too, maybe, right up in here. And two of those buildings are still there today. All right, let's have the next one. So there were excavations at a place called German Gulch in Silverbow County in the 1980s, and there was a really quite a large Chinese settlement there. And there were many, many artifacts taken out of this excavation, but nobody knew anything about Chinese artifacts, and so they sat at the University of Montana and several other places until about 5 years ago. Nobody ever did anything with them because no one could type them. There was no typology, there was no database, and so they did find some very interesting things. It included things like Chinese dates and olives in tins, sheephead fish and flounder, which illustrated a very widespread trade network. Although the buildings are gone, there were features that they could identify. And in addition to hearths, there's a type of kiln. Now this kiln is possibly a crematorium. While there's no physical evidence of human cremation in this crematorium that was discovered, the New Northwest magazine noted in 1874 that there were 6 Chinese cremated at German Gulch. So that, may be evidence. As we mentioned before, sojourning Chinese often bought that insurance to guarantee that their bones or ashes would be taken back to China. So that might explain the need for a crematorium. If I could have the next one. Anyway, the artifacts are only just now being studied by a graduate student. And the next one, there's quite a large variety of things that were discovered at German Gulch. So Montana lacked a database or a typology from which to work, and so these things were.
Ellen, where is German Gulch?
It's somewhere outside of Butte, on the outskirts of Butte, in a fairly remote area.
And in which direction?
I don't even know. I can't even tell you. I'm sorry. But I think if you look, yeah.
The BA&P Railroad ran through German Gulch.
Okay.
And you could take, or used to be able to take excursions on that, and they pointed it out.
I think if you look at the map, you can find it on the map. You can find it certainly on the topo map. Yeah. Okay, so if I could have the next one. So Dr. Chris Merritt really has done a tremendous amount of work on Forest Service Chinese sites. I know about this topic because I happen to have the privilege to serve on his dissertation committee. And I know that he almost single-handedly really is responsible for creating a database and a typology for Montana. And it's something that all other archaeologists can now draw upon if they do Chinese sites. But if I could have the next one, he did a number of excavations in partnership with the University of Montana and the Forest Service under the Passport in Time program, if any of you know about that. And my daughter actually is in the center there, and she was one of the crew members at this Poacher Gulch excavation. And Poacher Gulch really began Chris's study of the Chinese. It was the first site that he excavated. He assembled this crew in 2006, and he decided to concentrate on Poacher Gulch because local tales of Chinese terraces were really, really compelling. It was a very heavily timbered area in Sanders County. If I could have the next one, it's very remote. This is from the top of Eddy Peak, looking over Sanders County. And if I could have the next one, the site was unlike any other site known in Montana. There were these rock-lined terraces that spanned a steep hillside, and they were very similar to terraces found in Idaho, where the Chinese farmers are known to have grown crops. So this wheel, you see that the tree has grown through the wheel. They felt was evidence of great age. It was all moss covered. Forest Service archaeologists had actually discovered this site back in 1979, but Again, nobody knew anything about Chinese archaeology, so they didn't do anything with it. Locals believed that Chinese miners had built this, had built the terraces. So as the story went, Chinese workers laying tracks of the Northern Pacific became disgruntled over their low pay and mistreatment. So they left their jobs and headed to the hills to look for gold and silver. Sounds pretty logical. And these terraces did resemble terraces in Idaho's Payette National Forest. So between 1979 and 2006, these stories grew, and the Chinese terrace theory was so convincing that it was almost accepted as fact. It was accepted as fact. Everybody knew that the Chinese were, occupied this Poacher Gulch area. So if I could have the next one.
Well, were these terraces for food? Or
Well, I'm going to tell you what they were for in just a second. What the site turned out to be was something very different than what they thought. There were no Chinese artifacts to be found in the entire site. This is an artist's rendering, Chris's rendering of what it probably looked like when it was active. What it turned out to be that it was a hidden away place where people grew corn to make moonshine during the 1920s. And it taught Chris a valuable lesson that, you really shouldn't listen to what the locals say, because without doing the research, you really have to document those things. So if I could have the next one. He didn't look at that as a failure. Rather, he looked at it as a good lesson, and he went on to excavate China Gulch at Cedar Creek, which is in Mineral County near Superior. It's a very, very remote area again. And this site yielded a small collection of artifacts that actually provided the necessary material to create a typology for Montana. And it opened the door for studying other Chinese sites in Montana. If I could have the next one. So they found some very interesting information in addition to the types of ceramics. Next one. There were these U-shaped hearths that are found in other places, in other Chinese sites in Montana and elsewhere, and they're unique to the Chinese. That was known for sure. There's a series of these hearths at Cedar Creek yielded clues about the poor quality of life at that time in this very remote mining camp, where we know that from the census, 300 Chinese miners spent the winter of 1871. Next one. There was the usual evidence of opium use, which is part of Chinese culture, not very much different than whiskey was to white miners. If I could have the next one. This is Chris's depiction of what the site looked like when it was active based on the things that they found. And then the next one, Cedar Creek yielded this very bizarre collection of bone from one of those hearths. The bones are pig, deer, and sheep, and they are fragments. And when they tested them, I don't exactly know how they do the testing, but they discovered that these bones had been processed or cooked at least 4 different times. That tells you it's a very sad story that these people were starving, and they were getting every single bit of nutrition that they could out of these bones.
They put the squares on those for, is that dimensional comparison or something?
Yes, it's just to show the size. Mm-hmm. So these hearths are, like I said, they're found at this site and they're found elsewhere, and they're unique to the Chinese. And in this particular case, this was a very, very harsh winter, and they were living under very terrible conditions. If I could have the next one.
Were they probably railroad workers?
Yes, probably. Escaped railroad workers who gave up railroading to
Try to live on their own.
to look for gold. Mm-hmm. The small collection of ceramics from Cedar Creek included all of the major types of Chinese ceramics that you find here and elsewhere in Montana that are unique to the Chinese. So you have the turquoise celadon, you have the Four Seasons dinnerware, you have the brown glazed stoneware, and the blue and white bamboo. And those are the 4 key types of ceramics. If you have those 4 types, you likely have a Chinese site. If I could have the next one. So that actually began a typology and a database for Montana, and because of those identifications, other archaeologists can now do better work in excavating Chinese sites. One of those more recent excavations was at Virginia City. And Virginia City is rather unique because probably of all the Chinese urban areas that we know of, it's probably the most photographically documented. We have more photographs of Chinese residents in Virginia City than we have of Chinese residents elsewhere. So if I could have the next one. You have this Chinese woman, probably not a prostitute, probably a wife. In 1889, she was known as Chinese Susie. If I could have the next one. Then you have another gentleman, and the next one. And this one is a very, very rare photograph of the actual Chinese temple in Virginia City. And it's the only photograph that I know of that exists, so it's a really, really important photograph. It's in the collection, Virginia City collection, that's now housed at the Montana Historical Society. But you can see that it's a 2-story affair. If I could have the next one. And from that building, this banner came. The banner is probably as wide as this room is. And it has been translated. We're working on a Chinese exhibit for 2015. Talk about, looking ahead. But it will be on display, and it will be the first time it's ever been displayed to the public. It's really quite an impressive piece of silk, hand-painted silk. Next one. And this is very interesting. This is a panorama of Virginia City from 1868. You can see where the arrow is there in the right-hand corner. Notice those rounded roofs. We had an exchange student from China who got very excited when he saw those rounded roofs because he said, well, this is the way the peasants still make their roofs in China, where he was from. And so we never knew that we could identify the Chinese dwellings by looking at those rounded roofs, but you can see them there, and you can see them across the street, and they are exactly in the place where we know the Chinese settlement was. And so that's really a pretty cool discovery. If I could have the next one. And then the excavations that were done, this is where the temple is on the left-hand side where the arrow is. That's the temple in the 1870s. The green front buildings are, you can't really see them, but they're kind of there beneath that roof. And then tailing piles are evident everywhere, and this end of town is where the Chinese occupation was. So if I could have the next one. This is today's green front buildings, and Kate McCord, who's the archaeologist in Virginia City, wanted to determine whether or not, she wanted to actually prove whether or not the red light district and the Chinese settlement were together, as we assumed that they were. This was a brothel in the 1890s, and just to the other side is where we envisioned the Chinese occupation to be. And so if I could have the next one, she excavated test pits all around the foundation. They were going to be doing foundation work on this building, so it was necessary to do the archaeology around the foundation before that was disturbed. And so every colored-in square is where they did find Chinese artifacts. 13 is the only one where they didn't. And that one was full of some kind of tailing piles or something. So it's pretty evident that there was, again, the same symbiotic relationship between the women who occupied the green front buildings and the Chinese settlement right next door.
Why called green front?
Good question. It's not green now, but it must have been green back in the 1890s. I don't know. Good question.
Were many of the prostitutes Chinese?
No, they were not. Nope, they were not. We know who they were by looking at the census, and in Virginia City anyway, they were not. Could I have the next one? And so you find in those test squares around the foundation the same types of ceramics that you find in every other Chinese site. You have the blue willow ware, you have the Four Seasons ware, the celadon, and the brown stoneware. And then a beautiful, beautiful opium tray in the right-hand corner there. If I could see the next one, here it is, a little bit bigger. Had Chris not created the typology, they never would have identified this as an opium container.
Isn't that gold or brass?
It's like brass, and it's called a funds tray. It's from an opium can, but then they would crimp the edges, and it's what they would use to weigh the opium.
And is it stamped in?
Could I have the next one? And then there were excavations at Big Timber that were done a couple of years ago by Chris and another graduate student, Justin Moschel. And this is a very interesting excavation because it was late time period, 1930s, 1940s, very late. You don't have much of a Chinese occupation after the 1920s. And so Big Timber had a very long Chinese population, partly because of the railroad. Again, many single men. If I could have the next one, though. They were a very patriotic group and got together and formed an association and raised money to buy war bonds during World War II. Even though these guys were not citizens, they were very patriotic and really made a difference in the community. If I could have the next one. But the area that was excavated was the dotted area there, which is today a parking lot. But from looking at the Sanborn maps, they knew that the front half of it was at one time a Chinese laundry, another time period it was a Chinese restaurant. The back portion was a separate building that was a brothel, actually. And so the two establishments were within this excavation area. Okay, if I could have the next one. And it was very difficult excavating because it was really hard packed from being a parking lot for a very long time. If I could have the next one. But this is a one-dose medicine bottle, which is a very common thing to find in Chinese archaeological sites. And they're just these little teeny tiny glass bottles, but they're one dose of some type of medicine that you would buy from the Chinese herbalist or a pharmacist. If I could have the next one. And another thing that were very common were these go pieces, which are gaming pieces. If I could have the next one, it shows they're almost like marbles, but they're flattened. And it was some type of a very popular game. And the next one, this is the threshold of the building, of the Chinese laundry and restaurant. And this is really interesting because when they disassembled the wood, when they took the wood away, they discovered underneath this threshold, very carefully placed there, bones. So the bones were analyzed. I could have the next one. They turned out to be a cat's paw, placed on purpose under the threshold of this business establishment. So why do you suppose there would be a cat's paw placed very carefully like that underneath the threshold? If I could have the next one. Well, research tells you that cats were considered lucky. They were used to guard the silkworms, to protect them against mice and rats. And so we can only assume that it meant that it would bring the business good luck, to put it there. Have the next one. And this brings us to the tunnels. Every community has stories. If you have a Chinese settlement, you have stories of Chinese tunnels. And if you, I know that there are stories in Missoula, there's stories in Helena, in Billings, in Butte especially, and there are these tunnel systems, and they were, most towns across the West had tunnel systems. They were for steam heat delivery. That's the way they heated buildings. And sometimes they were placed there as storage vaults under the sidewalk or for deliveries, for ease of deliveries and storage. Yes, it's true that there were opium dens, sometimes underground, and sometimes there were Chinese businesses in basements because they were cheaper to rent. The places were cheaper to rent than they were above ground. But if you've ever heard this, people say, well, they had their businesses underground because they were so afraid to come out into the light of day. They were afraid they would be killed, or they were afraid, and they were forced to live underground because people didn't want to deal with them. None of that is true. And those stories certainly exist in certain communities. I won't name which ones they are, but it's very, very hard to convince people that yes, those tunnels exist, but there is absolutely nothing about any of those tunnels that make them Chinese. Everybody used the tunnels for one thing or another, but there is nothing that make them exclusively Chinese. In Big Timber, there were stories about the Chinese tunnels, and so the archaeologists did a lot of historical research. They wrote up a report, and what the community got out of the report was that they proved the fact that there were Chinese tunnels there. It's like the communities just don't want to let go of that story. If I could have the next one. If you're interested in looking further into Chinese tunnels, Google Priscilla Weggers, who is the expert in Asian artifacts and Asian culture in the West. She's at the University of Idaho. She knows everything there is to know about Chinese tunnels, and on her website there is a little essay about Chinese tunnels, and it will tell you that they are not Chinese tunnels, that she has looked at tunnel systems across the West in many, many communities where those stories exist, and she has never, ever, ever found any evidence of a Chinese tunnel. They are tunnels that were used by everyone. So that's my bandwagon. If I could have the next one. And then at Marysville, Dan Hall did some great excavations there. And they excavated a Chinese laundry that happened to be in the way of the highway that was being widened. And so this project was done by the highway department. If I could have the next one. And interesting thing about this excavation is that he did find this doll's head. Not this one, but one exactly like this. And so he concluded that this was evidence that there were Chinese who had children in this business. There's absolutely no census evidence to corroborate the idea that any of these Chinese occupants had children. And probably they wouldn't be playing with a blue-eyed doll like that if there were. My take on it is that if you read Kelly Dixon's Boomtown Saloons, which is a great book about the excavation of a saloon in Nevada City, Nevada, she has a little section on this particular saloon that was also a brothel in the upstairs, and they used dolls to show whether or not the women were busy. If they were standing up, they were available. If they were lying down, they were busy. And I think that that's what this indicates, because this Chinese laundry was right next to the red light district. They would have catered to the women of the district, in their laundry business. And I mean, to me, that kind of makes sense. Maybe there were Chinese children playing with the doll, but to me, I like the other theory better. Anyway, so anyway, that was a great excavation. And the other thing that they found at Marysville, underneath this Chinese laundry, they actually found the whole body of a cat. And the cat's skeleton was placed on a platter. So we need to do more, more research on our cultural traditions, but to me that might mean good luck to the business owner. If I could have the next one. So we're beginning to do some good interpretive signage on Forest Service land, thanks to Chris Merritt's work at many Forest Service sites. And if I could have the next one, there are remnants that you'll see in various places. This happens to be Jeff Davis Gulch in the Dillon area that still has a road marked Chinatown Road. And if I could have the next one. Just a few of the prominent Chinese people that many Montanans know or know of. Tommy Haw was one who grew up in the Dillon area. He was adopted by the Orr family of the Poindexter Orr cattle ranch. There are several different stories about how he came to live with the Orr family, but he did come with them from California and grew up around the cattle, had his own cattle herd as an adult and his own brand, and his brand was OC for Orr's Chinaman. If I could have the next one. And he's buried with the Orr family in the Poindexter Cemetery, which is unfortunately now a cow pasture. And there's some efforts to see if it can't be better protected. But anyway, next one. And then Dr. Hugh Epoch is a really interesting character. He was one of those guys who went after the boycott in Butte. But he was a physician, highly trained in China in herbs and herbal medicine. And he was the only person who could cure William A. Clark's daughter of an ulcer. And so his reputation was established because of that. During the Spanish flu epidemic in 1918, he was the only doctor that successfully cured people of the flu. And because he had this fine-tuned training in herbal medicine, somehow or other he knew what to do and knew how to cure them. His wife died in 1923 of ptomaine poisoning from eating tainted canned food, which was fairly common back then. And he died in 1927. Their remains lay in a funeral home in Butte until 1953 because the son squandered the money that he was supposed to use to send the bones back to China. And they were both buried in paupers' graves in 1953.
Are they still in Butte?
Yes, they're in, I think it's Mount Moriah Cemetery. I'm not sure which cemetery. And then Flora Wang has recently written a wonderful book. She grew up in China and had an arranged marriage. Her husband came for her. He was a Helena businessman and came for her and brought her to Montana, where she had a number of children. He died. She had to raise her children, keep the restaurant business going, and really became quite an independent, wonderful person. If you ever get a chance to meet her, she's still around and just a real firecracker. If I could have the next one. Billy Key is another one who was a resident of Lombard, Montana, which is a little community that doesn't exist anymore. But he owned property there, was mayor, and he built the inn that was there. If I could have the next one. He built this High Point Inn and had a very lax system of handing out rooms. If someone came in the middle of the night, he would always leave the cash register open so that they could put their money in and take a key and just take whatever room that wasn't already taken. He and his family, he had a number of children, went back to China to his first wife. And apparently the second wife was treated very poorly and became a servant to the family. So that's the story anyway. If I could have the next one. So here you see, you know, just some, it's just really important that we study these artifacts and that we, you know, that's how we'll learn more. We're only beginning to scratch the surface of the contributions that this ethnic group made. And, you know, it's a really very exciting time because a lot of people now are interested in Chinese culture, Chinese archaeology, and I think we'll make some great discoveries in the future. Could I have the last one there? And I would be glad to take questions if anyone has any. Yes.
The Chinese miners, were they coal miners or gold miners, precious metal miners?
Gold miners.
They were gold
Yep.
miners.
From took their experience to California, became really adept at placer mining. So they were placer miners. Mm-hmm. Yes.
When you showed that picture early on of the Chinese oven, something entirely different popped into my mind, because I had looked at some artifacts that resident at the intersection of I-90 and Rock Creek, as they call it area. The Chinese railroad crews had dropped coins and pieces of pottery and the medicine bottles and stuff, and was rototillery his property. Because there was a group of us looking for the John Mullen Road footprint. His house and property is right on it. So he knew that, but he also discovered that the Chinese crew were through there. But what I'm getting at though is when he showed me the Chinese coin that he found amongst all this stuff, that Chinese oven looks like what I Googled as a coin from 1890.
Could it be the hearths, those U-shaped hearths, and not the actual domed ovens?
Well, just the general shape of round with a hole, the coins were not solid. They were.
Yeah.
They had I don't know why Chinese railroad people, builders, were carrying Chinese currency when they weren't paid. You didn't get into that area. Were they sending money back home? But this must have been American currency and so on.
Right.
But they had them, and this guy found them in this vegetable garden. So I'm not sure just how many of these people along that route, current landowners were rototillery home their gardens.
Oh, that's
Finding
really
stuff.
interesting. That's really interesting. It could be that somebody had a cache of coins, you know, and lost it, or something happened to them, or, you know.
When you showed them to me, I took a picture of it, and I was searching 1890 Chinese coins, and that's what popped into my mind as why anybody would call it a Chinese oven when they didn't make make bread. It looked maybe like a Chinese coin from a distance, that somebody
maybe
transferred that.
Exactly.
A few minutes ago.
Yeah, I don't know. That's interesting. Yes.
I was just a little bit late, so did you mention about the Chinese buried in our Missoula cemetery?
I did mention that there was one Chinese burial found there, that it was, and there may have been several, and it may be that they did use that cemetery. They also, white people used it also, though.
Well, where they are, it's just as you're driving into the cemetery, and to your left, in that first section, there's a lot of Chinese in there.
Really? Well, I think, you know, it probably is the place where they did bury. That was the city cemetery. We talked about that being the city cemetery from about 1866 until 1884, and it was even used after that too. So I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah.
I think she's speaking of a more contemporary cemetery, further up, like up at the end of Scott Street, up in there.
Oh.
There
Oh,
are
that's a
Chinese
different
people-
one.
Yeah, we have a couple of them up there, don't we? A couple of cemeteries up
Yeah,
there on the
two
north
of them.
side.
Okay. Okay.
Which one are you talking about?
Oh, in the lower Rattlesnake area.
It's gone now.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. It's developed, and there are houses there now, but there are still burials there.
You know, I've read Missoula was called Garden City because as you came out of the Hellgate Canyon, there were huge gardens. You think the Chinese grew those?
Probably they could have. I wouldn't be
City would
surprised.
be
Yeah,
Chinese
I wouldn't be,
based
I
in
wouldn't be
I
surprised.
had heard before they were called Hughes Gardens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There
They
were,
not Chinese.
I think that those were not Chinese, but the Chinese may have grown produce, I don't know. Your Chinese settlement is a little bit later and gone a little bit sooner than most of the others, because I think the 1880s would have been the peak for Missoula and the Chinese occupation because of the railroad coming through. And once the railroad was done, there wasn't much for them here. There really wasn't any mining going on. In the other communities, the Chinese continued to mine, although they also, owned businesses and whatnot. They also did placer mining too on the side, along with everybody else. Yes?
You mentioned in Virginia City that they had actually built a temple. I'm assuming this would be a Buddhist temple?
No, it was a, would it have been a Buddhist temple? We really don't know that much about it. The banner that came from that temple, and temple may be a loose term, is actually a rule of conduct. It's almost like a Masonic temple. Rather than, it was religious, but it was also kind of in the Masonic vein, fraternity type temple.
Because I was very curious when you mentioned that about the various forms of religion
Yeah.
and spirituality that they
Yeah.
would have brought with them.
Right.
I'm wondering if you had any references I could go from there.
No, I really don't. There's very, very little written about that. The best thing that you could do is take a look at Chris Merritt's dissertation, which is on the internet. Just Google his name and you'll find it.
Okay.
And he does have some information about that. Okay?
There's evidently still quite a Chinese population in Spokane.
Uh-huh. Yep.
I knew a guy that was a city inspector in Spokane, and he got to be friendly with the head of the town over there. And anytime he had problems with a Chinese restaurant, he just mentioned this guy's name, and that was the end of the problem.
Anybody else? Yes.
During World War II, were the Asian appearance of Chinese mistaken for Japanese, and they were persecuted as much as anyone from Asia if they were in residents of the country? They may not have been interned, but
Yeah.
there was that.
I think there was that discrimination always.
I've heard they would wear tags that said, "I am Chinese."
Yeah, I didn't see that one.
When I was researching one of the earliest superintendents of the Bison Range, Frank Rose, I discovered that when he did move to Missoula as a professional plant collector, that his home was built on the cemetery on Poplar Street. And the current residents say they believe that story, and it is based on the Sanborn maps, it's true, but they said the city hall kept it hush-hush that houses were being built on it.
Sure.
That's true, and that's not an unusual thing. We have the same thing in Helena. We have Robinson Park, which has a development all around it. That was the original Catholic cemetery, and only about 200 of about 1,700 graves were moved, and they're still there. If you look at how the power lines are laid, the power line workers were told to just go around the coffins, and if you look at a map, they aren't, in straight lines like usual. They're like 90-degree turns all over the place because of that. Yeah.
Reading the landscape, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. Anyone else have a question or comment? Yes?
I came in late, but did you say anything about Chinaman Rapids on the Kootenai River?
No, do you want to say something about it? Tell us.
No, it's, you talked about the persecution of the Chinese in the logging camps.
We didn't get into that, no. Would you like to?
There was apparently an infraction of a Chinaman up in Libby, and a bunch of the loggers got together and tied a Chinaman to a log and sent him over down the river over the rapids, which surely have ended his life. But, and I don't know if it was just one, but that name sticks. And I don't know exactly what could have evoked that kind of contempt for the Chinese in a logging camp.
Probably.
Hard-working.
Yeah.
That's probably why, because they worked hard.
Yeah. Yes.
I just have a funny memory growing up, and I'm in my 50s, so I wasn't around in the late 1800s when the Chinese that you're talking about were here. But my sisters and I, for years and years, were trying to remember a song we learned when we were little about a Chinese man. And I just happened to remember it about 2 years ago, and I called my sisters on the phone and I just started singing the song to them because I was so excited. But I could only remember one verse, and I think it illustrates how they were thought of. It's, my mother told me to answer the door, "Oh, Ma, I don't wanna." I opened the door, he fell to the floor, that crazy old man from China. And then it was 4 or 5 verses of the stupid things this Chinaman would do because he was really drunk or whatever.
Yeah.
Does anybody else remember that song? Ron, you're from Ohio too. Did you grow up knowing that song? I don't know where it came from.
Huh.
Yeah.
Huh. Yeah, all those little snippets, you know, we do remember those little things from our childhood every once in a while.
Our Chinese window exhibit, by the way, is just around the corner. If you haven't had a chance to see it, it's artifacts from Butte.
From the Meiwa?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
That's an interesting question. How far did the Chinese migrate east? If they came from the west coast and they were working the rails and lines, much history of that early migration of Chinese east?
You know, as far as I know, they only went places where there was mining. And, you know, I'm sure there were Chinese in Chicago and New York, but they were there for different reasons. Obviously not for mining. And in the West, anyway, most of the Chinese were here because of the mining opportunities. And I think that's why you don't really find them in Minnesota.
You think they went in as far as the Black Hills, in the Dakotas?
Probably, yeah.
I found pieces of opium tins up above Bear Mouth,
Oh, yeah,
in some of the old
Yep.
placer minings up there.
yep, I'm sure there were.
I didn't realize what they were until I saw pictures.
Yeah, now you know what they are, yeah. Did you have a question?
Oh, no, just on Chinese in the Black Hills, there's a wonderful book that was written a couple years ago by Li Ping Zhu, professor of history out of Eastern Washington University, and an archaeologist, where they collaborated about a very, very good book written.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
Give me a moment, I'll think of it.
I can only think of the article in Montana, the Magazine of Western History, No Need to Rush, is the title, I think, of that article, is it?
That was, I believe, dealing with the Boise Basin prior to his publication.
Yeah,
His
it was
own
prior to the,
dissertation.
Yeah.
The other one,
yeah, okay. Yes,
The 7,000 miles versus 3,000, we're assuming Easterners had to go the tip of South America?
yeah, they had to go by boat.
That predates the canal. Yeah. 7,000 miles.
Yep, long way around. Yeah. Hi, Patrice.
There's an article that Kim Brigham posted in Montana yesterday. In 1903, a reporter, a journalist had walked through one of the establishments on Front Street, and he describes the
Oh, that was yesterday?
Montana yesterday, Kim Brigham said.
Oh, okay. When it was?
Oh, you can get to it. He posted it quite
A long time
but
ago.
you can-
Okay.
If you, he's got tags. And you
Yeah.
can
Oh, good.
pull it up.
Oh,
It's
cool. Oh, I'll
It's about a
definitely.
Trap door. There was a room that extended over the river with a trap door. And,
Oh, interesting.
so-
Oh, that's interesting.
I had just one more question.
Yeah.
I remember visiting the Meiwa, and Dory was telling us that the Meiwa was almost like a mall, and that there were all sorts of services available.
Yeah.
One of them being letter writing.
Yep.
And was that commonplace for other larger city centers like these?
You know, I'm sure it must have been, and there were like Masonic-like temples in most communities that were Chinese. I mean, Chinese Masons aren't the same as Masons, you know, that we think of, but they were these fraternal organizations, and you could, you know, you could get services, you know, I think, like letter writing and whatever. As far as I know, there weren't those mall type situations. That's the only one of those that I know of. But the fraternal halls, I think, may have served, something of that purpose.
In that fashion.
Yeah.
I know that she said the Meiwa was,
Mm-hmm.
really almost like a mini mall, an early mini mall with all kinds of services for the miners, for who would come and have the Chinese write letters for them, and of course all the herbs and cooking and laundry and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Seems like a great number of the US gold miners going to California went on the California Trail, and that was less than 2,000 miles in about 3 months, I think, or so.
So at what time period was that?
48, 49, same time, as soon as the news got out.
Took a while for the news to get there.
Yeah, but it doesn't seem like it get to China faster than it would to the...
Maybe some got there, but the vast majority didn't make it for quite a while, at least a year after. That's why they're 49ers and not 48ers.
Stevens Street on the Sanborn map, I think now it comes back Ryman.
Oh, maybe so, yeah.
Otherwise, we'd have two Stevens.
That's a good thought. That's right. That's right. That's right. Yeah, I bet you're right.
And of course, on the Sanborn map, north of the railroad track, there's a Chinese laundry, right, Ellen?
Yeah, of course.
Lots of stuff,
Of course.
Ellen, I may have missed this, but did you talk about the situations in China that compelled so many Chinese to come?
Just that there was, I don't remember if I mentioned that there was a famine that brought them here in Guangdong province, and that's why so many came when gold was discovered in California, because there was an overpopulation boom, and there was a terrible famine, and people had to do something. Yeah.
Were these southern China or northern China? Because our country is divided kind of by north and south. Was that famine in a particular...
It was that Guangdong province. It was that particular province, and almost all of the Chinese that came to the United States came from there.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, I think they have a saying about that province that they'll eat anything that walks, flies, or crawls.
Plus the opium wars that were going on.
It's a very complicated thing. Yeah.
What was going on in China at that time was southern China was oppressed by the rulers in Beijing, which were northern Chinese or Manchus, which was why the Chinese that made it to America were used to being oppressed. They were part of the reason for the famine and the mistreatment was the government didn't pay attention to them. If I've read accounts of the Angel Island poetry that's written on the walls there, where they bemoan the fact that their government won't stand up for them. They've come to America and are being treated so badly, and the emperor won't do anything.
Yeah.
Because they're southern Chinese.
Yeah. Thanks, that's a good comment. Anyone else? Well,
Under one of those Chinese emperors were around the 1200s that was obsessed with world exploration, and he had them building large boats, and they were practically all over the world. At that time, reforested, or clear-cut a lot of China, building these boats. And then when he passed on, why the next emperor wouldn't allow him to build those boats. They found the remains of one in the Sacramento River not too long ago.
Really? Wow. Wow. That's interesting. My goodness. Anyone else? Well, thank you all very much for coming.